Hello Joachim, thank you for joining us today. You are considered as the MDR expert, or the medical device regulation expert in Europe. We have received a lot of questions from our colleagues, and I'm looking forward that you are going to share with us this afternoon a lot of very, very good answers.
Certainly, Eric, it's a pleasure.
Thank you. Let's go. Let's start with the first question, Joachim. What are actually the critical deadlines for compliance with the medical device regulation and for implementation of this regulation?
Well, this is a very complex question, Eric. The date of entry into force of the regulation was May 25. We are now in the so-called transition period, which ends May 26, 2020. This is the date of application. For Class 1 medical devices, the date of application is a hard deadline for compliance. Higher risk devices may only switch to MDR certification once their notified bodies have been designated for the MDR. This, however, is not expected to happen before the end of 2018. However, old medical device directive certificates may be used until they expire. One can continue to use the current AIMDD or MDD certificates, provided they have not expired for 4 years after the date of application, which is May 26 of 24. There are, however, some conditions for using the so-called grace period. No significant changes are allowed. The device needs to remain compliant with the current directives, and new medical device regulation vigilance and post-market surveillance requirements must be applied.
Joachim, there is another question which is very important also. What do you think are the key impact factors for the EU MDR, but specifically for Medtronic, not in general?
I think there are indeed several ones, Eric. First of all, the notified bodies will be much more monitored by their competent authorities than in the past, which have an indirect but significant impact on manufacturers under their surveillance. In addition, the requirements for clinical data and in particular for equivalence considerations have been strengthened. Also, some of our products will be up-classified. For instance, many spine products. And implantable Class 2B devices are practically handled like Class 3 devices. Hazardous substances in devices must be identified, labeled, and their use justified. The post-market surveillance requirements are also increased. And finally, the MDR introduces UDI labeling and device registration in Europe.
Joachim, talking about labeling, you mentioned UDI, but are there any other labeling changes that we need to consider?
Unfortunately, yes. For instance, any device label must have an indicator that the product is indeed a medical device. Further, for implantable devices, an implant card must be delivered with the device. In many cases, instructions for use must also be updated to meet specific labeling requirements.
Are there any changes, Joachim, that MDR will bring in terms of device equivalency requirements?
Equivalent devices need to be equivalent with respect to technical, biological and clinical properties to such extent that it can be demonstrated that there is no clinically relevant difference. The manufacturer must also be able to demonstrate equivalence by having access to equivalent device data. And the medical device regulation even requires a contract between the manufacturer and the equivalent device manufacturer to access the technical documentation of that device. This will, in practice, limit the use of equivalence claims to devices from competitors.
A very critical question we received, and I think that we already have heard that question a lot before, but will there be more stringent notified body requirements for clinical evaluation reports, the so-called CERs, under the medical device regulation, Joachim?
Yes. MEDEF 2.7/1 revision 4 is a big step in this direction of the medical device regulation requirements in this area. However, the MDR goes further as it requires, for instance, a publicly available summary of safety and performance to be continuously updated.
A question very close to my heart, because I have always been, for Medtronic, very much involved in post-market surveillance, in post-market activities. How will MDR change post-market surveillance requirements?
First of all, the medical device regulation requires a post-market surveillance plan for every device. So-called post-market safety update reports are required in addition for Class 2 and Class 3 devices. Further, the vigilance reporting timeline is in general reduced from 30 to 15 days.
You mentioned earlier in our conversation UDI, the Unique Device Identification. Do you think that there are major changes with respect to for Europe under the MDR with the introduction of UDI?
Yes, Eric. First of all, manufacturers, importers and authorized reps need to be registered in the European database called EUDAMED. Also, devices must be UDI labeled and be registered together with some key data elements in this database.
As to OBL, own brand labeling, what will the MDR bring for own brand labeling for our devices?
Every manufacturer must have access to full technical documentation according to the medical device regulation. This would require that OBL manufacturers hand over those files, which may not be easily done. It is expected that in practice this requirement may put an end to the OBL manufacturing as we know it under the Medical Device Directive.
Joachim, you've told us a lot of things, and it seems like an enormous amount of work. Where do we start as Medtronic?
Yes, Eric, indeed, this is a lot of work. The good news is that we have already started quite some time ago to create a playbook where we defined our intra-company interpretation of the articles with a preliminary regulation was under development and published by the EU Council. Several BU have already started to work on gap assessments.
I've heard a lot of things about a very important and critical task for Medtronic actually. It is called the so-called 3 buckets. The must-have, the can-go and the TBD bucket. Do you know what that means, Joachim?
Sure, Eric. It is critical that business and finance teams of each business unit assess their respective product portfolios and create 3 buckets, as you say. The must-have, can-go and the to-be-defined buckets. Products that drive revenue or are of strategic importance for Europe and other regions that rely on EU certificates for product registration will end up in the must-have bucket. Technical work streams will then be able to focus on the must-have buckets at each business unit, conduct a gap analysis against the medical device regulation, identify potential gaps, and define a strategy how to remediate those gaps and the costs. Once this bucket is under control, the to-be-defined bucket needs a technical assessment to identify gaps and remediation costs. Based on this, business and finance can decide which products to add to the must-have bucket and which to the can-go bucket. It seems simple, but it will be a lot of work. However, I'm confident as we have qualified teams able to accomplish this transition from Medical Device Directive to Medical Device Regulation.
Joachim, thank you very much for all these answers that you gave. Really, this is much appreciated, and I think the whole team of colleagues that have been waiting for all these answers are very pleased to have heard you today. So thank you very much again. And the only thing what I really learned also is that there is still a lot of work to do and that we really need to move on. You said that we have experts on board, you're confident that we are going to make it, but should we not start running? Is that not what you mentioned to say?
Yes, Eric, I think we better start running right now.
Okay, so we should then activate the whole crowd to start running with us, isn't it?
Absolutely.
Okay, so let's run, Joachim. There we go.